Hello and Merry Spookmas! For those of you who don't know, Spookmas is that wonderfully strange time of year between Christmas and Halloween, in which the lazy people have yet to take down their Halloween decorations, and the enthusiastic people have already put up their Christmas ones. It leads to a beautifully strange mixture of naughty and nice. So this Spookmas we've decided to have a look at 5 horror-themed Christmas movies. This is not a top 5 list. I've probably only seen 9 horror-themed Christmas movies in my life, so I'm not exactly qualified to do a top 5 list. So think of this more as 5 short reviews more than anything else. So without any further ado, welcome to Grin Grimsly's 5 spooky Spookmas Christmas horror films worth watching if you're into Christmas and horror. We'll probably shorten that name for the video's title.
In this video, I'm not gonna bother looking at Gremlins or The Nightmare Before Christmas, because although they are spooky and Christmas themed, they are already very well known, so there's not really much point for me to tell people to watch them because most people have already watched them. However, that said, if you haven't already watched them, go watch them because they are good and you're one of the only people on this planet who hasn't already watched them. That out of the way, the first movie we're gonna have a look at in this video is Silent Night, Deadly Night. It was the first Christmas horror film I've ever watched, and it is the first slasher I've ever watched, which means, spoiler alert, this is a slasher film. The film is basically Christmas's answer to the Friday the 13th franchise, in that it is also a slasher film which launched a franchise, and that unlike Friday the 13th, it's not set in Friday the 13th, but instead Christmas. In this video, however, I'm only going to talk about the first film in the franchise, because otherwise this entire video will be talking about Silent Night, Deadly Night, which means that I might as well have called this video Silent Night, Deadly Night Reviews, which I didn't, which means I cannot just talk about Silent Night, Deadly Night. The film follows a character named Billy who witnessed the murder of his parents on Christmas Day when he was younger. He then had to live in an orphanage with violent nuns. However, unlike the Blues Brothers, this did not somehow nourish his musical career, but instead turned him into a violent serial killer. The body count in Silent Night, Deadly Night is much lower than that of any of the Friday the 13th movies, but it's still well within the acceptable range of a slasher film. The killings in the film are very well done and nice and gory, so if you're into that sort of thing, this is the movie for you. And just like most slasher films, the killings usually follow the victims committing a morally deplorable act, such as opening the door without your shirt on to let your cat in at night. That'll teach her. While the movie is not anywhere near as good as any of the Friday the 13th movies, it is quite enjoyable, and it does add an interesting psychological angle to Billy that we never really get from Jason. That is to say that while we do know why Jason does what he does and that he's basically the mind of a child in an unstoppable killing machine, we don't really get to see much of his downward spiral. However, with Billy we see his insanity slowly develop and fester, from his strange encounter with his creepy grandpa that gave him a strange moral understanding of what Santa does, all the way to the moment he snapped. Seriously though, what is with creepy old dudes in slasher films? His grandpa reminded me a lot of that weird guy from the start of Friday the 13th 2. While this film is by no means my favorite on this list, if you are into slasher films and you do want to see a guy dressed as Santa slaughtering teenagers to, get you in the mood for Christmas, then this is certainly the spooky Spookmas horror-themed Christmas film for you. Very similar in story, but slightly different in execution. See what I did there? Is the film Christmas Evil, also known as You Better Watch Out. This film basically follows the psychologically scarred child from the song I Saw a Mummy Kissing Santa Claus. The child goes on to grow up and identify himself strongly with Santa Claus, taking it upon himself to punish the naughty and reward the nice. This starts out to be relatively innocent, extremely creepy, but relatively innocent. However, as the story develops, he finds some people that are so naughty that they need more punishments than simply a good old scare will do. And so once more we get a serial killer dressed up as Santa Claus. Though technically considered a slasher film, I hesitate to call it one, as this film largely focuses on the psychological decline of the main character. And it does it in an incredible way that is just completely enthralling. Not unlike Silent Night, Deadly Night, this film follows the murderer rather than the victims. However, unlike Silent Night, Deadly Night, I would suggest this to more people than simply the slasher film genre fans. The killer is also much more likable than Billy, because while he still has very, very confused morals, he is actually also rewarding the good, as opposed to simply punishing the perceived wicked as the would-be Silent Night Deadly Night Santa does. Overall, I enjoyed Christmas Evil a lot more than I enjoyed Silent Night Deadly Night, which surprised me because when I started watching it, I sort of perceived it as a cheap ripoff. Although that could be because Christmas Evil actually came first, which would make Silent Night Deadly Night the cheap ripoff. Overall, Christmas Evil is a fantastically enjoyable Christmas film, and I do highly suggest you check it out this Christmas season. Moving on to the third film we're going to look at, we have the 2006 Black Christmas. I make sure to specify the 2006 version because there was a 1974 version. And by talking about only the 2006 version here, I'm not suggesting it over top of the 1974 version. The simple matter is I've not yet been able to find a copy of the 1974 version, so have not seen it. So I'm not really going to suggest it or even comment on it because I just don't know anything about it yet. This film is the film that I enjoyed least on this list. In fact, I didn't really enjoy it at all. However, I am leaving it on here because I'm sure some people will enjoy it. The film is also listed as a slasher film, but I think that's slightly a mistitle, as it's more like a gore horror film, and I've never been a huge fan of gore. I like the over-the-top, almost cartoony gore that you get in the 1970s and 80s slasher films, but I've never really enjoyed the hyper-realistic gore that you get in some of these modern films, and this film has its fair share of hyper-realistic gore. There are close-up shots of eyeballs being ripped out of skulls and all sorts of horrifying stuff that I cannot show in this video without it probably getting pulled for some sort of violation. The film is almost entirely set in a sorority house, which some bright spark decided to set up in the house of a still-living serial killer.
No, you see, serial killers murder repeatedly for sexual thrill. Billy Lenz was a spree killer.
My mistake. I found the overall tone of the film to be a little bit too dark and a little bit too serious, and I found myself not liking any of the characters. However, as I said, if this is the kind of movie you're into and you want to see some super hyper-realistic gore and some really disturbing stuff, this is the film for you. And hey, I'm not judging. Moving on to the slightly more obscure, we have Rare Exports A Christmas Tale. This 2010 film not only is the first not slasher film on this list, but it's also the first one that deals with an actual supernatural thing, which I found to be extremely refreshing. I get sometimes tired about seeing the levels of depravity of humanity, and I like to see the darkness that lies in the shadows. And the darkness and the shadows in this film are no disappointment at all, as a small Finnish town comes in contact with a group of frozen zombie-esque Santa Claus. If you're like me and you're getting hyped up for the up-and-coming release of Krampus, or however you actually pronounce that movie, then this is probably the best film to tie you over, because they both draw on the dark, mythical background of Santa Claus. The film is not too dark in theme, it has some light-hearted, humorous moments, and visually it is just fantastic. The film is not too horrific, and the film does not contain too much gore. I would say this film is more spooky than anything else, so if you're not too keen on horror movies, but you do like sort of zombie monster movies, you can get away with watching this. It should be noted that this film is Finnish, which is one of those languages that is not English, so if you speak English and you don't speak Finnish, you should probably bring your reading glasses to this one, as it is subtitled. If you're one of those people that don't like reading subtitles, then I suggest you find a friend to read the film to you. Overall, I would suggest you watch this spooky Spookmas film because I watched it, highly enjoyed it, and decided to recommend it to you. Moving on to the fifth, final, and last film on this list, we have Carol for Another Christmas. Coming out in 1964, this is easily the hardest to find and most obscure film on this list, which I think is a crime against humanity and nature because of how enjoyable the film is. So just how enjoyable is this film, you might have asked if this video was a more interactive experience? Well, very enjoyable. For an indication of why this film is so enjoyable, you have to look no further than the writer. It is written by the great Rod Serling. And yes, that is the same Rod Serling who wrote The Twilight Zone. If you've watched many other videos on this channel, you would know that Grim, the other guy on this channel who frowns too much, is a very big fan of The Twilight Zone. And spoiler alert, I too, just like pretty much everyone on the earth who is sane and has seen it, am also a very big fan of The Twilight Zone. And just like the first 3 seasons of The Twilight Zone, A Carol for Another Christmas is an extremely well-written story. Just like the title of the film might and most certainly does suggest, it is a version of the Christmas Carol. For those of you who have only seen A Christmas Carol represented in multiple different versions in TV Christmas specials like on The Simpsons and The Flintstones, A Christmas Carol is one of Charles Dickens' masterpieces. For those of you who don't know, Charles Dickens was an author, which is someone who writes books, which is sort of like restaurant menus, but longer and with storylines and characters. It's all very complicated and antiquated. But the long drawn out point I'm trying to get to here is that Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol for a very specific reason. He was, among other things, attempting to draw attention to the poor and the suffering in the world at the time of writing his book. This is important because A Christmas Carol has been done so many times it's almost impossible to count at this point, and many of these versions sort of lose part of the point of A Christmas Carol, simply adopting it as a moral journey for Ebenezer Scrooge as he finds out that he should not be a dickhead. An example of this can be seen in the Simpsons version of The Christmas Carol, where Homer, after having a Scrooge-like experience, endeavors to be the kindest man in Springfield. This goal of a moral transformation is of course part of A Christmas Carol, but is not all of it. As I said, one of Charles Dickens' main goals in A Christmas Carol was pointing out the problems in society that we should be doing more about. This is not just pointing it out within the story to Ebenezer Scrooge, but actually pointing it out to the reader. It was aimed at shining the light on these issues to the reader themselves, forcing the reader to identify themselves with Ebenezer Scrooge because of their apathy towards the suffering in the world, which many of these TV versions of A Christmas Carol fail to really readdress. The reason all of this is relevant is because Charles Dickens' intentions were not lost on Rod Serling, and A Carol for Another Christmas is exactly what it sounds like. It is a Christmas Carol rewritten for the world of 1964, and as such, just as Charles Dickens' novels address the social issues of the time, Rod Serling's A Carol for Another Christmas addresses the social issues of the time of 1964 when the movie was written. In doing so, Rod Serling, far from simply pointing out that in the modern day of the 1960s the poor still exist, also goes on to tackle the further issues that we managed to create since Dickens' time, including the stranded, starving, and homeless refugees following the multiple wars of the 20th century, the horrible suffering of war itself, and especially that which was brought by the bomb, and finally the possible future that continued hostilities on the world stage could bring. The film was written partly with the intention of promoting the UN, so not surprisingly it preaches a very strong and very obvious message of diplomacy and international friendship, while also preaching a message of involvement in the world's problems. Though A Carol for Another Christmas was written for another Christmas, it is perhaps now more relevant than it has ever been. We once more are facing a breakdown in understanding and communication. Seemingly unavoidable and horrifying hostilities arise and people are advocating for the re-establishment of us and them, while all the while the refugee problem has become worse and worse possibly than it's ever been. While A Carol for Another Christmas may have been written for another Christmas, if you're going to watch any spooky film this year, Rod Serling's reimagining of A Christmas Carol is the one that nobody should miss. And with that, we've come to an end of films we're going to have a look at in this video. If any of them have piqued your interest, head down to your local video store and pick up a copy of Silent Night, Deadly Night, Christmas Evil, Black Christmas, Rare Exports, A Christmas Story, or A Carol for Another Christmas.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that, subscribe, as we make more stuff like that and other stuff that's not like that but made by us. Until then, I am Grin Grimsly, wishing you a Merry Spookmas.